This is a Pasco Media production. Please visit pascomedia.com.
In Latin, Renovo means to renew, restore, or revive. This is the show where we explore the miraculous nature of the mundane as we look at one part of the Catholic tradition to help you engage more fully in the practice of faith. Past episodes are available at renovopodcast.com. I'm Doug Tuke, and today we're going to tackle a good subject. I wanted to do a show last year about Martin Luther King Jr., his impact on faith, and especially the relationship that he had with Catholics, given all the incredible racial tension that we navigate now in our lives. So we're doing a show on Catholics and the civil rights movement. I want to break open kind of the reality of how we navigated the real heightened aspects of the movement in the 50s and 60s by giving a little bit of history, but also really just digging in to what that relationship means today and what it meant at its height. When it came to civil rights in the 50s and 60s, you have to understand that like the Catholic Church kind of played like a kind of an ambivalent, unclear role. Most church leaders in the South didn't really challenge the morality of the state-sanctioned racial segregation. The average white Catholic basically held the same racial views similar to fellow white Southerners. I mean, it wasn't some dramatic rebellion. There's some notable exceptions. There's notable exceptions, but overall, the Catholic Church, it was an outsider within kind of a largely Protestant South, and it sort of failed to take a real active role in the organized mass protests against racial discrimination, but it did witness quite a few efforts by specific individual members to aid the cause in civil rights. And that's what the show is really about. Even if a person very personally, very, very within their heart found segregation immoral, it's just important to note that Catholic leadership did allow separation in the churches. In Louisiana specifically, the state with the largest black population, the black Catholic population, blacks could at all times suffer all kinds of humiliations within the church. And though officially welcomed at any Catholic church in the state, there's great record of blacks being kind of nonetheless segregated during services. The usual pattern was for like a majority of white parishioners to allow blacks to sit separately in the rear pews. And we know that in like Alabama, blacks often received communion dead last, that there was still a very echo of culture, separation of culture. And that's to be expected. That's to be expected. Cardinal Patrick O'Boyle said, "I just don't see any reason why a little black boy or girl doesn't have the same right to a Catholic education as a little white boy or white girl." And his statement is bold. He was saying that in the DC area. He was naming at an early time that this needs to change, and it needs to change now. He was talking about integration well before Catholic education really wrapped its mind around that. And that's a big deal. I mean, he wondered out loud what a lot of African Americans around the country were asking themselves on many occasions through the 60s. I mean, the issue of race specifically it's tied to the history of the United States. We know that the glories of national heroes, they're always compared with the horrors and the brutality of slavery, the Jim Crow, the resistance to civil rights. And it's really kind of a tragedy. It's a blemish on the image of the U.S. That it's been talked about multiple times, books, movies, everything. But not super well known is the role of the church in that issue. It's one of the things that the church has been proactive and engaged in the fight for civil rights, and it has been silent and even sometimes hostile to the movement in some regions. The fight, the civil rights movement, it's not. This is important for us to know as listeners. Like it's simply not contained to one area of the country. And a lot of people feel like it probably is. It's, these tensions only exist in the southern states. And that's just simply not true. Housing issues, wherein African Americans began moving north to live in sort of once racially static neighborhoods was really, it was the major area of discontent in the early to mid 20th century. Northern cities like Chicago, Philadelphia, New York, Milwaukee, these are hotbeds of tension, political tension, which of course affected spiritual tension, or what we should say is religious tension in the way that we practice the faith. So though racial issues clearly had existed since the very beginning of time, the U.S. history, colonial era, all the way to the mid 20th century, one of the most, and by far the most, like volatile periods of racial strife in our country specifically is where the civil rights movement of the 50s and the 60s really made a lot of change. Okay, but it was preceded by other attempts at change with the status quo in the 30s and the 40s. And this caused a lot of upheaval in American society. It caused a lot to embrace change and a lot to resist, well before the greatness of Dr. King. Okay, so this is important to note. And while on a grand scale of history, the church's involvement in the larger civil rights movement was actually pretty minor, leaders in the church still found themselves really at the forefront of trying to incite change, and in a few instances actually providing some resistance to change. So let's talk about that. So one of the earliest practitioners within the church of interracial cooperation was Father John Lafarge, who helped to he founded the Catholic Interracial Council of New York in 1934. Lafarge was really involved in a lot of other groups that sought equality for African Americans, including the Federation of Colored Catholics. And when that organization kind of split in 1932 over whether it should continue as an interracial group or strictly an African American group, that's when Lafarge left to form the CIC New York, the Catholic Interracial Council in New York. So the organization specifically sought to foster interracial cooperation toward the goal of racial equality, not only within the church, but in general society. It grounded all of its teachings in Catholic theology. So CIC New York would support like a lot of like fair housing, labor issues, in addition to supporting specific civil rights organizations such as the NAACP and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, through lots of local and national events, as well as its journal, the Interracial Review. These were huge strides in a very unpopular time. So by the time that the national organization actually came into being in 1961, the National Catholic Conference of Interracial Justice, or NCCIJ, his group CIC New York, had actually influenced really the formation of other CIC groups all over the country. And with the NCCIJ in place, CIC New York actually became a lot less focused on national stuff and really more on local, became more of a New York vehicle for change, which is pretty cool. So among the church in America's most vocal supporters of civil rights was also the National Catholic Welfare Conference, which is now the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, USCCB. You've probably heard that 1,000 times. Their specific department, the Social Action Department, or SAD, that's a terrible acronym. The organization really it took up the cause of a lot of social issues from the time that it was conceived in 1919, including labor and international relations, interracial cooperation, and civil rights specifically. So therefore, it kind of seemed a natural fit for what is now the USCCB to kind of grab a hold of it and push it forward. So during the civil rights era, SAD, it often became really the first voice of the U.S. Catholic Church on all kinds of issues of racial equality, and prior to all the general statements that they've issued by the U.S. bishops as a whole, they were really contacted and negotiated. USCCB nowadays still tons of just letters and official stances. And then, Catholics, I don't actually really care where you stand on the ecclesial spectrum, but it's good for you to know that the USCCB has been outspoken about healthcare issues, about immigration issues, about violence, which really takes no political side. I mean, it's very clear. We will not support health insurance that provides abortions. We will not support political agendas that discriminate against immigrants. I mean, it's both sides of the aisles that we are navigating today. This is really similar. That voice was really part of its incarnation way back when. Father Raymond McGowan, who headed SAD from 1945 to 1954, would have a huge hand in creating what's called the Seminar on Negro Problems in the field of social action, as well as he testified before a presidential committee on civil rights and on like contract compliance in terms of like fair labor practices, which is pretty cool. So in addition to that, that department, SAD, sought to work for specific employment equality, same wage, regardless of color, by partnering with the Catholic Conference on industrial problems. And it also published a journal, Social Action Notes for Priests, which was designed specifically to keep clergy informed on racial issues. This was a really active group. So even with all the work that was kind of accomplished by SAD, it's kind of amazing. The Catholic community in the United States, it really needed leadership from its bishops, and in some cases, the American hierarchy it didn't disappoint. So as the then NCWC, which is now the USCCB, as it released like a lot of statements in the 50s and 60s stating the church's position that segregation was a moral issue, that a person could not call himself or herself a Catholic if they had segregationist beliefs. Those were very public statements. It was a position that had actually been stated by the Vatican in the past. If you see Pope Pius XII's Summi Pontificatus and Pope John XXIII's Pacem in Terris, they really kind of echoed those voices of the time, which is kind of amazing. But here's the thing, like not every bishop or priest actually waited until this national organization made a decision. So lots of people were proactive. Archbishop Joseph Ritter of St. Louis, he issued an order in 1947 to end segregation in Catholic schools with the diocese 7 years prior to the Supreme Court decision to end segregation in Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka in 1954. That's pretty cool. Archbishop Rummel of New Orleans called for the integration of churches within the parish in 1953 and would call for the integration of Catholic schools 3 years later, though this later act would actually not be achieved until 1962, which is still incredible. So the response of the Catholic Church was big. In Alabama, where the Selma demonstrations, the biggest, and we'll talk a little bit more about those later, demonstrations in Birmingham, it kind of highlighted more of like a gradualistic, pretty conservative approach to civil rights by church leaders, and really kind of the most visible evidence of that that kind of notion of gradualism. It came in 1963, an open letter to Martin Luther King Jr. The letter was called A Call for Unity, and 8 white Birmingham, Alabama clergymen basically denounced Martin Luther King Jr.'s civil rights organization as sort of outsiders seeking to destroy the racial harmony that they already had within the city. So there was clergy tension saying, no, don't do this. I mean, the open letter really, it acknowledges the grievance of the African-American people, that everyone deserved basic human respect. But the writers asked the African-American community to accept the racial situation for the time being. So it was a real attempt at a sluggish change in response, and kind of a black mark on the clergy at the time that were really trying to make integration happen. One of the authors of that was a Catholic official, Joseph E. Durick. He was the auxiliary bishop of Mobile, Alabama, and historically, Mobile, one of the largest and most important Catholic regions in the South. Bishop Durick signed the letter to the civil rights leader and kind of demonstrated the position of the Alabama Catholic Church within the civil rights movement at the time, and that obviously caused a lot of tension. So the state Archbishop Thomas Toole, for example, they denied all the priests the right to participate in demonstrations or to speak out against racial segregation. They really wanted to keep that away from the pulpit. They wanted to keep it away from the priests in the Alabama area. And officials kind of held up human rights in theory, but they really refused to give legitimacy to protesters such as Dr. King, who had broken kind of the prevailing state segregation laws. That just gives you kind of a sense in Alabama specifically of what was going on. But there were attempts among Catholic laity to effect change, and both the Southeastern Regional Interracial Commission, SERENCO, that's a pretty famous part of the movement, and the Commission on Human Rights, CHR, right away went to work to really eradicate any legal Southern racism. And that's a big deal. The CHR got organized in 1949, and they really aimed to end it, to end racial segregation within Catholic churches specifically. And the group held integrated masses and sent petitions to the Archbishop. And likewise, Serenco, founded in 1948, was a fund among college students, which is awesome. They held interracial masses and spoke openly with the Archbishop about lifting the ban on race mixing in churches. So there were really powerful voices surfacing at the time, which is kind of cool. Some Southern clergy also just refused to acquiesce at all in the official ban against questioning racial discrimination against the African-American community. In 1961, Father Albert Foley brokered a deal with Joseph Langan, the Catholic mayor of Mobile, Alabama, to desegregate downtown eating establishments. And even earlier in 1956, Archbishop Joseph Rummel of New Orleans, who we mentioned before, declared the gradual integration of schools, churches, and hospitals. So there was movement. There was big, bold movement in the Bible Belt by certain leaders. And then there was kind of that sort of just that kind of like curmudgeon approach. And this is where it gets hairy, guys, because this is church teaching. A bishop is a bishop is a bishop, and they are the bishop of their area. So they have the canonical right to really dictate policy there. And this is, quite frankly, this is retaliation against that in some ways in some regions. But what's fun to watch sometimes is when some bishops tell other bishops to stick it in their ear, that they may have spoken poorly. And that's happened in the United States Catholic Church multiple times. So it's kind of incredible. The voting rights demonstrations that were led by Dr. King in Selma, Alabama. We mentioned that a little bit before, but like these are like the most significant events of the modern civil rights movement. Okay, you have to understand these rallies. They successfully rallied supporters of racial justice behind the need for total government action to protect the right to vote among long denied to African Americans. So the Voting Rights Act, described by a lot as like the single most important piece of legislation, it passed Congress. It was a direct result of these Selma protests, and Catholics actually played a pretty prominent role in Selma, and a lot more than in previous civil rights demonstrations. I mean, they just never before had Catholic activists actually turned out in such large numbers. So in 1965, early in 1965, this is such a cool little story. Edmondite Father Maurice Willette, a priest, pastor of St. Elizabeth's African-American mission in Selma, a white guy, he tells a story about how he answered a knock at his door. And Dr. Martin Luther King was standing on his porch and wanted to meet him. And Dr. King said, "The Negro people tell me there is one white man in Selma who is black." And he said, by introduction, and then he said, "And I want to meet him." So on Dr. King's part, a Baptist minister, he took the initiative to say, where is this leadership that I hear about? Where is this support? And such a grueling, difficult social time to extend that support. Just amazing stuff. In addition to like all of these, the different moves, lots of clergy would take parts in civil rights demonstrations. Obviously, Selma was the big one, and take part in protest. And leaders took part in the March on Washington, where Cardinal O'Boyle, gave the invocation prior to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech, as well as taking part in the Religious Leaders Summit that sought to encourage Congress to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So at the highest level of politics, there was a Catholic presence, a deep-seated religious advocacy. And though, the names of all those in the church, they're not going to reach the level of recognition as Dr. King, Rosa Parks, Medgar Evers. You have to understand, those that were involved, they made a lasting contribution to the movement, and particularly within the Catholic Church. And I think that's worth celebrating. I think this time of year, as we look to Dr. King, his heroic, virtually martyrdom, and all his baggage. That's something that's important to mention is no one's perfect. We're all saints were sinners, excluding Mary. We talk about her another time. But like Dr. King brought with him, some brokenness too, that there was still this astronomical passive movement that he championed that is completely consistent with gospel teaching and healthy church teaching, healthy church theology, and that there was a role to play. That where there was silence and there was discouraging remarks, there was also heroes of the movement. And I think this is an important show because I think right now we're at a crossroads where there's going to be a lot of like political turmoil meets the pulpit. And to ignore that, quite frankly, is not consistent with the good Catholic teaching. It's a matter of justice, and your church has spoken and is a long-standing advocate for the greatness of civil disobedience and the promulgation of truth. And it's good for us to know that. It's good for us to be active in that way. What a great show! What a good way to honor Dr. King, and certainly the relationship that the church had with the success of the movement that he so beautifully championed. Don't forget to visit renovopodcast.com for past episodes. Please subscribe to, review, and rate our podcast. We always appreciate your input. Your topic suggestions, questions, and or comments are always welcome at doug@renovopodcast.com. Learn more about me at dougtook.com or on Twitter and Instagram at DTOOKE and the number one. Friends, always remember to engage the tradition, a tradition of justice, a tradition of advocacy, and quite frankly, friends, live the conversion. Until next time, God bless.